Phantom Brothers. Here we go.
The 120th Fighter Squadron is more than airplanes and pilots. It is a rich heritage of courage and determination. Back when airplanes were made out of wood and covered with cloth, tough men flew those fragile planes. During the First World War, they were used as a way to keep an eye on the enemy. But it wasn't long before other planes started shooting at them to keep them from seeing what their side was up to. And that's how fighter planes got their start. When the war ended, most of the flimsy airplanes were sold off by the government. But there were a few people in the War Department who saw the value of air power. They even proposed that the National Guard have a few observation squadrons. In Colorado, there was some interest, but they needed 64 recruits, 14 officers, and 50 enlisted before receiving federal recognition as being a capable flying unit. The Colorado National Guard organized enough men to become the first flying National Guard outfit to receive federal recognition. The 120th Observation Squadron was born. That first year, the 120th bought some land and built an airbase near Colorado Boulevard and I-70. They named it Lowry Field, to honor a Denver native who had been shot down during the war. Then they received their first airplanes, the Curtiss Jenny. There was a bit of skepticism that the Jennies could even fly over Colorado's high terrain. But once the Jennies were unpacked from their crates and assembled, the crews of the 120th did it anyway, advancing the progress of aviation in the 1920s. And when the 120th chose a mascot, the choice was simple: the Colorado Cougar. The mountain lion has keen observation skills, agility, and very sharp claws and teeth. The Cougars trained for war, but they also flew mercy flights. Sometimes it was transporting passengers, other times it was figuring out how to get emergency supplies to people who were snowbound or stranded in remote areas. They were also asked to show off a little, to give aerial demonstrations and increase the public's interest in aviation. That went on through the 30s and up to 1941, until President Roosevelt activated the National Guard. Even before Pearl Harbor, there was enough concern over Germany and Japan that the Guard was called up on January 6, 1941. The 120th was the first to get the call and was redesignated the 120th Reconnaissance Squadron. As the Second World War escalated, the 120th was disbanded with men and equipment being absorbed into other units. By the end of the war, most every National Guard unit had to be re-established and rebuilt. Once again, the 120th Fighter Squadron became the first post-war National Guard aviation unit to receive formal federal recognition. And just like after the First World War, the 120th would fly surplus airplanes. The 120th would be flying out of an old bomber training base east of Lowry called Buckley Field, which was renamed Naval Air Station Denver after the Air Force transferred Buckley to the Navy in 1947. Of course, there were all sorts of requests for the Air Guard to help find lost airplanes or perform a flyby or two to help dedicate an airfield or maybe celebrate a rodeo. But once word got out that Colorado had a flying squadron that could wow the crowds, the calls really started coming in. And they would have continued, except for the Korean War. In 1951, most of the 120th's pilots were sent to Korea. The ground crews were also called up, and everyone was distributed to units throughout the Air Force. By the time they were deactivated in 1953, some had simply had enough. So the task of reorganizing began all over again. A year later, the 120th Tactical Fighter Squadron had nearly doubled in size and was back at it. Their flying was so good that the Minutemen became the official precision demonstration team of the Air National Guard. You may have heard of the Navy's Blue Angels and the Air Force Thunderbirds, but there were three teams. Colorado's 120th Fighter Squadron had the other one. The Minutemen performed all over North America and Central America as ambassadors for the National Guard and the American people, until federal money was cut off in 1959. Some think the Air Force was simply jealous. By 1960, the Navy no longer needed an air base in Colorado, so Naval Air Station Denver became the Buckley Air National Guard Base, the first Air National Guard base in the nation. During the 60s, the Cold War was beginning to get hot, and like clockwork, the 120th was called up again. First in 41, then in 51, then in 1961 for the Berlin crisis.
We seek peace, but we shall not surrender. That is the central meaning of this crisis and the meaning of this government's policy.
And as usual, the members were distributed to various Air Force units. After returning home in 1962, the unit trained hard for whatever it may be asked to do next. In 1968, North Korea captured an American ship with a Colorado name, the USS Pueblo. President Johnson reacted by activating nearly 15,000 guardsmen and reservists to active duty. The 120th was sent to Vietnam and became the first ever Air National Guard organization to be called to combat as a unit. This time, no one was going to be farmed out to other units. There was even talk among the active duty Air Force that the National Guard wasn't up to Air Force standards. Shortly after the 120th arrived in Vietnam, General Westmoreland paid a visit to the unit and asked when the 120th would be acclimated and ready for combat. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Cherry pointed out the window at an F-100 that had just landed and said, "That's mission number 172, taxiing in now, sir." The active duty quickly understood the professionalism the Guard brought to the fight. 15 months later, the 120th returned home after flying more than 10,000 hours and over 6,000 sorties. The 120th flew the F-100 until 1974, when it was replaced by the A-7 Corsair. The A-7 was a change from the supersonic F-100. The Corsair was a subsonic heavy plane with an air-to-ground attack mission. But it could throw a real punch. The A-7 could carry 2.5 times more ordnance than a B-17 could carry during World War II. It was also the first of its kind, with computerized guidance systems for getting bombs on target. And it was the first time the 120th had received new airplanes, fresh from the factory, not some hand-me-downs from active duty. Of course, the 120th Fighter Squadron earned another first with the A-7. They became the first squadron to become combat-ready with the A-7D in either the Air National Guard or the Air Force. They also earned national recognition, taking the Gunsmoke competition Top Gun trophy twice in the A-7, first in 1981 and again in '87. There were a lot of deployments for the 120th in the 70s and 80s, all of them peaceful deployments. By 1990, the A-7 was showing its age, and the 120th was selected to convert to F-16s. In August that year, Iraq invaded Kuwait and the Gulf War began. It ended before the 120th had even received its first F-16. But the troubles in Iraq didn't end once the war was declared over. Some Iraqis wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and a civil war was brewing. Operation Southern Watch and Operation Northern Watch were started to protect Iraqi civilians and enforce a no-fly zone. The 120th deployed 3 times to protect Iraqi civilians during '96, '98, and 2000. Then, September 11. The response was almost immediate. Protect the country. Colorado's F-16s flew on patrol 24 hours a day for 4 straight days.
And more than a dozen aircraft will deploy around midnight tonight. Live at Buckley Air Force Base, Raj Cho.
During Operation Iraqi Freedom, the 120th was part of the Total Force Shock and Awe air campaign at the start of the war. They were sent back to Iraq, and the 120th Tactical Fighter Squadron was first to land their fighters at Balad Air Base. They've rotated in and out of Iraq a number of times and have been tasked with providing air security over South Korea, too. Of course, serving the state of Colorado is the 120th's primary mission. The F-16 has served the 120th Fighter Squadron well over the years. But there's a new kid a-comin'. Will it be the next generation fighter plane? Well, the future's pretty hard to predict, but you can bet that whatever shows up, it'll be flown hard and used well by the 120th. They've gotten into the habit of flying their machines to the limits of their capabilities, regardless of the circumstances. And the men and women of the 120th Fighter Squadron will serve with honor, continuing the proud legacy forged by those who were here before. keeping faith with those who taught them to fly, fight, and win.